Hey everybody, this is Jim the Tabletop Engineer, and welcome to a new Let's Paint a Mini video. Tonight I'm going to be painting another one of my Diehard Minis. This is the last one in a series of like reptilian sci-fi mercenaries. So I got to get him done, and then I'll have a whole gang of 5 of them. Now tonight, while I paint, I'm just going to ramble. And what am I going to be rambling about? Glad you asked. So recently, and I say recently, depending on when you're watching this, it could be quite a while back. But there is currently, right now in December 2022, there's a new video making the rounds by Questing Beast. It's a channel that I enjoy watching. I did not know this. I never put 2 and 2 together, but the author of the channel is also the author of this OSR booklet that I actually have a copy called Knave, K-N-A-V-E. And it's like this simplistic rule set for running like a fantasy RPG. It's incredible. I will try to find a link and put it in the video description below so you can check it out. But on Questing Beast, the question, well, it wasn't really a question. The comment was made that right now in New York City, there is this like DM crisis, specifically 5th edition DM crisis. Like there's a shortage of dungeon masters. And I'll admit, when I first watched the video, I was like, really? You know, is this really, seriously, we've reached this point where there's this shortage of dungeon masters and people are worried about it and complaining about it? But then I took a step back and I looked at my own gaming history over the last 5 to 7 years. Yeah, 8 years close. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's not only a problem, but I could say that I've become part of that problem. And I'll explain why in just a minute. Before I get down to the tabletop to start painting, I want to show you 2 quick books because I'm going to be referencing these. This is the Old School Essentials Referee's Tome, right there. This is the Old School Essentials Player's Tome. 2 books. Each one about 300 pages, 250 pages. Each one is about 250 pages, okay? This one right here, the Player's Tome, has all the rules you need to play a character. Thief, magic user, fighter. It has the spells, the weapons, and just some very simplistic rules on like water vessels, horses. I think there's some dungeoneering suggestions, and then there's some stuff on hiring like NPCs, what we would call specialists or hirelings or mercenaries. The majority of playing Old School Essentials is found in this book. This book right here has the combat rules, the saving throw rules, the monsters, the creatures that you will encounter, and plus the rules for how to read the creature stat sheets. There's some very, very simplistic rules in here on, you know, how to create scenarios and how to run the game, but it makes a certain assumption that if you're running this game, you sort of know how to run a fantasy RPG. There's no tutorial in here that teaches you how to be a DM or a GM. All right. There are a lot of charts for like the GM to reference for things that you would find like on a GM screen, for example. But other than that, if you want to play Old School Essentials, if you're a player, you get this book. If you're a GM, you get this book. And that's it. Now, there are books like, they sell extra books. They sell like, this is just a reference book. And this is really for the GM. It's just a real quick summary of all the charts, the significant charts in the big book. Did I do it? No, in the referee's tome. So you don't have to go flipping through. You can usually find it very quick in here. The Old School Essentials series also puts out a magazine. They don't put it out regularly. It's called Carcass Crawler. They're up to issue 3. They did release an issue 0 with a Kickstarter. So technically there's 4 issues out. 0, 1, 2, and 3. And they just provide extra rules, maybe some extra classes and races, but they're not coming out on any regular basis. So the game can really be played with these 2 books. So let me throw the camera down to the table and let me get started painting, and I'm going to explain to you why I guess I'm part of the problem, and I'm going to tell you why I don't really care. So let's move the camera down And I've got my speed paints to my left. I've got my readers on. And I've got my miniature painted. And I've got some brushes. So it's time to go. All right. So, again, this is not a video where I'm teaching you about painting because I am not a professional painter. Instead, what I want to do is I want to talk about this issue of, is there really a DM shortage? Well, I mean, obviously, in some areas, there appear to be. And it's very interesting because, now, traditionally, and not traditionally, even today, if you are playing an RPG like Dungeons & Dragons, you have to realize that there are, on average, 4 to 6, I say on average, I don't know what the exact number is, but there are usually 4 to 6 players for each GM, right? I mean, most GMs aren't running a one-to-one game. Now, there are people that do that. I know people who play a GM and they have one player and they run these adventures, and I've never done it. Well, that's not really true. I think when I was younger, I may have run a game for like maybe 2 players. I know I did. It was a friend of mine, Brian, and his brother. So it does happen. But typically, especially today, when you run a game, you usually expect to have between 4 and 6 or more players. Now, when you get over, in my opinion, when you get over 6, it really starts to bog the game down. But I'm not going to say that's a fact because every GM runs a game differently, and it's very possible that a GM can run it with 8 or 10 players and run a very, very tight, fun game. For me, the magic number is 5 or 6. I like 5. I like 6, but I like 5 better. But I'll go up to 7. I mean, if a player showed up and didn't have a table, and and I felt like our adventure was at a point where we could get another player to the table, I'm not against it. So, but just for talking purposes, let's assume 6 players. All right, now, if you have 6 players for every GM, and you're dealing with 1 million players out there, or 40 million, or 20 million, or whatever Wizards of the Coast says the number is that are playing Dungeons & Dragons, and I don't even think they know. I think there's a lot of people that buy the books but never actually play. And speaking of that, there are some videos going around about that, about how it's okay to be a gamer that doesn't actually play games. I'm cool with that. I play games, but I know people that buy rule books by the dozens, read the rules, enjoy them, but rarely play, and there's nothing wrong with that. So, as a GM, I should tell you that for many, many years, I ran an advanced Dungeons & Dragons game. This was back in the 80s. In the 90s, I didn't GM so much. I played more than I GM'd because the 3.5, I was in college and I just did not have time to devote to being a GM, or at least I didn't feel I had the time. I was busy in engineering school and getting an English degree. I was a dual degree major, and I was constantly overwhelmed with school, and I just didn't feel I had the time. But jump forward a few years, I skipped 4 completely. Just didn't have any interest in it. I saw it being played, and it just didn't grab me. And I was out of college and starting my career and trying to build a name for myself in my own industry or whatever. And so 4 came and went, and then 5 was announced. Actually, it was called D&D Next, I think, or I forget what it was called. I think that was it. And it was announced, and I remember thinking, hey, this might be the time for me to get back in, because I was missing it. I was missing playing games. And so anyway, 5e came out, and I bought the Player's Handbook, and I bought the Monster Manual, and I bought the GM Guide, or DM's, Dungeon Master's Guide, and I read them, and I was like, okay, I can do this. I had been a GM long enough that I wasn't worried about being a GM. I figured I could just make it up as I go, which a lot of GMs do, and I would learn the rules as I went, and if there was something that I felt really mechanically needed to be incorporated into my game, I would do it. And it turns out that 5e has a lot of that. 5e has a lot of mechanics that a GM needs to learn in order to run the game properly. And I hate to say it that way, but it's really true. D&D or 5e D&D is rules heavy compared to other fantasy RPG games. And I don't know if that's why it's popular. I don't know if that's why players currently are playing it by the millions or whatever. But it was not within a year or two of being a 5e DM, I started just sort of I was sort of like really not into it. And I had players, and I was a DM for 5e from like 2014 or 15 up to right before COVID hit. So let's just say 4 or 5 years. I was a GM, and I showed up every Wednesday night as much as possible, and I ran a game, and I was happy, and I enjoyed it, and I loved my players. I had some great players. But there was something about 5e that I just couldn't put my finger on that really didn't grab me as fun. One of the things I didn't like about 5e was it required a lot. There was a lot on the GM's shoulders. And I mix GM and DM. Sorry, I do that. But there was a lot on the GM's shoulders. The GM, was expected to know all the combat rules and all the spells and all the monster stats. There was, if you didn't want to be doing page flipping, and trust me, the 5e Dungeon Master's Guide is huge, and the Monster Manual is huge. And if you want to be a GM that is not a page flipper, constantly flipping through the books, looking for the reference you need, you've got to memorize it, or you have to wing it and just make it up as you go. If you don't know the hit points of a Minotaur, you just sort of go, oh, it's probably about 40 or 50. You could be wrong. You could be right. It doesn't matter. But to keep the game flowing quickly, you had to make those kind of judgments. And you quickly realized that 5e players so often knew the monsters just as well as you did, or better. And so if you had to make a quick decision to say, as a rule, I didn't tell my players how many hit points a creature had, but they would track it. They knew how much damage they were doing. And I would I would sometimes get players after the game say, how many hit points did that thing have? Because it should only have 20 or 10 or whatever. And I would say, I just buffed it up a little bit for you guys or whatever. But really what I was doing was I was winging it because I didn't want to take the time to look it up. I did get to a point where I would photocopy or take a picture of the stat blocks for all the creatures I had for that night's game, and I would print them out and cut them and paste them onto the back of a GM screen that at the time I was using. I've since gotten to where I don't even use a GM screen. But I did that because I was sort of tired of the players, catching me on that, and it wasn't that I was embarrassed about it, it was just the way I played. But if they wanted me to play by the rules, I would play by the rules. And if the monster called for 150 hit points, the monster was going to have 150 hit points. And that's when I started noticing that the game was getting bogged down. Because if I wasn't page flipping, the players were page flipping. And if the players weren't page flipping, then we were playing a combat scenario that was taking an hour or 2 hours. And I kid you not, there were game sessions at night where we would stop one Wednesday and say, okay, we'll pick up with the combat next week. We would enter a combat situation, and I'd say, okay, we don't have time to finish this tonight. We'll pick it up next week. Well, we would start the next week at, say, 7 o'clock or whatever, and 2 hours later, we were just wrapping up the combat. And to me, that was very unfulfilling as a GM, to dedicate a 2-hour session to 2 hours of combat. And I was finding that frequently I would have to stop the game because a player would say, I want to cast spell X. Well, between Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and 5e, I can't tell you a percentage, but I can tell you the spell count, the number of spells, Cleric, Druid, Illusionist, Wizard, Sorcerer, Warlock. It was insane. I could not remember them. And so I would stop and I would say, okay, can you tell me about that spell? Tell me what the DC save is, or tell me what it does. And let me tell you something. Nothing breaks the momentum of a game, in my opinion, or at least in my game. Nothing killed the momentum faster than having a player want to cast a spell and then taking 5 or 10 minutes to flip through the page to find it and then explain it to me and then have me maybe say, oh, well, that spell's not relevant because it's only for touch, or it's only for range of this, and you're at this range. Now, if the spell did turn out to be something that they could cast, then great. But I quite often found that they were calling upon spells and feats and magic items, so many that I did not know, or I just wasn't able to call them up quickly enough without stalling the game, that I found that the game was just not moving forward. And because it wasn't moving forward, I stopped enjoying it as a GM. Now, the players may have been enjoying it, and I think they were because they came back every week. But it took 2 or 3 years. It was a slow death for me of realizing that 5e was just not, it wasn't fun for me. I grew up in the early 80s when D&D started hitting its peak. It came out in 1974, but I didn't discover it until 1980. By that point, the advanced Dungeons and Dragons books were coming out slowly. They weren't all released at once. I was playing what they call the blue book, the Holmes box, or the blue cover of basic D&D, and that allowed me to move right into advanced D&D. And let me tell you, advanced D&D was all about the dungeon crawl. So was basic, really. It was about taking your heroes down into the deep, dark dungeon and finding treasure and getting out alive, hopefully to return and do it all again later at another time. And so for me as a GM or a DM, and for the players, Dungeons and Dragons was about dungeons. It was about dragons if you ever made levels that crazy high that you could get up to meet a dragon. Most 1st to 5th level characters would just die at the sight of a dragon. But I guess my point is that I started realizing the most fun I had with Dungeons and Dragons was when I was doing simple dungeon crawls, and we were tracking things like turns, and we were tracking things like food and torches, and there was some resource management stuff. The players had fun doing it because it was always trying to figure out new ways to go just a little deeper into the dungeon before you had to turn around and leave so that you could make it out alive. And it was about this time that Professor Dungeon Master, who we all know and love, Professor Dungeon Master, mentioned in one of his videos this game called Old School Essentials. And I was like, what is this? So I went online and I downloaded, or I can't remember if I purchased or downloaded. I think there was a free version. I think it's still free. I think there's still a basic set of the rules you can download for free, and I got it. And I read it, and the funny thing was, as soon as I finished it, I was like, wait a minute, this is very familiar. I did not know about OSR. I wasn't really up on that. I'd maybe heard of it, but I didn't know what it was really about. And so I read the rules, and I was like, wait a minute, this is very familiar. And I went and got my old blue copy of the basic Dungeons and Dragons set, and I still have it. I still have it on the shelf over there. And I started thumbing through it and reading it, and I was like, this is basic D&D. It's the same thing I played when I was like in 6th grade. And that hit me so hard. I was like, people play this. This is what I want to be playing. And so I went and I bought the books. I bought the thin books, and then they put them together in these two that I showed you. Those are called the advanced books. They're basically just a compilation of the 4 basic books and the 4 basic books for the DM, which was treasures and spells or treasures and monsters and some other stuff. They just sort of combined them, and that's fine. I'd rather have them in 2 books than 8 books, which is what it was. And but I was like, this is the D&D I used to play. This is the D&D I loved growing up and playing, and all my friends played, and I want to play this again. And so I basically said, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to play I'm going to play Dungeons and Dragons Basic, or my version of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And I'm going to make this available. I'm going to tell people this is what I want to run, and if you want to play it, you'll have a table. Hang on one second. I got to get something. Had to get one of my other minis as a reference for the skin color. So anyway, about this time that I was really getting interested in running OSC, it was time for Mace. This was not this year's Mace, November, but November of 2020. 2021, excuse me. And I put out the word that I was going to run a game of Old School Essentials. And I didn't know if anybody was going to be interested. But sure enough, I believe I had 6 players. And some of my friends played at the table. Christian and Eric, I remember they, and Eric's son Mac, they were playing. They sat down. Eric, I think, had said he'd never played an RPG before, or maybe it was he'd never played a fantasy RPG. I can't recall, but he had a blast. I ran them through a very basic, real quick dungeon crawl, and I can't recall if anybody died. I think somebody came pretty close, or somebody did die. But you know, in basic D&D, characters died. In 5e, it's hard. Even if you're a GM and you want to kill the players, which I'm not that kind of GM. I know that there are GMs out there who love, total player kills. They love to see the players squirm and worry about their characters. That's not the kind of GM I am. But I do recognize that the kind of D&D I play is very tough on characters. They die. And so I honestly can't recall if anybody died. But I do know that it was very, very dangerous. They had some really close calls in the combat. And I was loving it as a GM. They seemed to be loving it as players. And when the game ended, I had people tell me that they said that was so much fun. I had a couple new people there who'd never played anything like it before, and they raved about it. They were like, "Man, that was just the funnest experience," and it made me happy to know that that there was still something about this old school basic D&D that could draw people in. And then COVID had ended. Stores were starting to, take up the mask issue. They weren't going to enforce masks. One of my local gaming stores made an announcement that they were going to start having game night on Wednesday night. And, of course it was going to be D&D 5e, which I was fine with, but I told them, I said, look, I'm not interested in running 5e. I want to run Old School Essentials. And they said, yeah, that's fine. And that was cool. They were very serious. They were like, yeah, man, you run what you want. Especially since Adventures League sort of like disappeared and nobody could figure out, there wasn't any organized play. So if I was willing to come and run a game of, Old School Essentials, they were like, yeah, come run it. So I think I put the word out. I can't remember if I did it on Facebook. I think I did. I think I put it out on Facebook that, hey, I'm interested in running a 5e. Is anybody interested? And it was like crickets. Total crickets. And I'm not blaming the players. Listen, most players who play Dungeons & Dragons, they want to play 5e. And so when someone says, hey, you want to play this game of blah, 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 and if they've never heard of it, of course they're going to say, I'd rather play 5e. I get it. I do believe I had a couple players say, that they were interested, but they really wanted to continue with their 5e game, which I didn't take offense at that. But ultimately what it came down to was I just didn't feel there was enough interest. Didn't feel there was enough in it. I didn't want to be that GM who planned and made all these, now granted, planning with OSC is a whole different level, easier level than 5 in my opinion. But I still, you put in the time, you want players to enjoy it, and it does require a certain amount of time to plan a game that your players will have fun with. And so I basically was like, well, look, if it's really not of interest, I'm not, even if it was just like 2 players, that's not interest to me. I was looking for like six players. I wanted to get a table of 6 players, and I just felt like I wasn't getting that. I wasn't going to have that. Now, partly it was just me saying, well, at the time I was like, well, nobody's speaking up, so I guess nobody wants to play it, and I just canceled. I was like, oh, I'm not going to do it. So now, jump forward. This has been, I guess D&D's been going on now for maybe half a year. at the game store. And now I'm hearing through these videos that, like in New York, they're having a DM shortage. I'm like, really? I mean, it makes sense. I mean, it's, there are definitely fewer DMs or GMs than there are players. But are there really that few? I just don't know. What I do know is that I'm not interested in playing 5e. I don't want to GM. I don't want to be a DM. I'm not going to do it. It's just not. It's not for me. I have no desire to return to 5e. I have no desire to play whatever the next version is. D&D 1. D&D, is it D&D 1? Yeah, D&D 1 or 1 D&D. I can never remember what it is. I think it's D&D 1. I have no desire, no interest. Now, granted, I will probably end up looking at the rulebook, the DM's guide. But as I understand it, it's going to be a very similar mechanic system to 5e, right? It's going to be a successor to 5e, but they don't want to change it so much because apparently you can still play 5e. It's going to be like compatible. So that tells me all I need to know right now, that it doesn't sound like 6 or D&D 1 is going to be the game for me. So where does that leave me? Well, obviously I want to run an old school Essentials game, and I will run it at conventions if given the chance. I didn't get to run it this year. I was just didn't feel like I had time, and I didn't put the prep in for it. I had a lot of things going on before Jeff Con came that I just wasn't able to dedicate the time to it. And most of that was just related to my job. It wasn't game related stuff. It was just I just didn't have the time. But I think I'm going to start early, and next year for Jeff Con, it's called Mythic Con next year. I plan on running an old school Essentials game, and I'll put out the word that I'm doing it and let people sign up if they want to play, and we'll have a good time. But I have zero interest in running 5e or 5.6.6 or whatever it's going to be called. I just have no desire. And I know that sounds horrible because I know that a lot of my players enjoyed being at my table. I'm not saying that, I'm not bragging. I'm saying I tried to run a good, entertaining game for my players, and I think I did. And sometimes I'd run a dud. I mean, every GM has a dud game, or at least once a month or once a year, you're going to have a dud game. And so I was okay with that. I mean, not every game is going to be a winner, but overall, I tried my best to do the best I could to give my players a good game. And I'll do the same with Old School Essentials. So, to return to this discussion of shortage of GMs, well, yeah. I mean, I think the most experienced GMs out there are GMs who have been playing the game for some time, right? I mean, you become an experienced GM because you GM. And then the more you GM, the more you start to figure out your own style and the things that work at your table and the things that work for you and don't work for you. And so there is this experience level for GMs. And so the shortage of 5e DMs, well, COVID, and this is just my opinion, COVID really sparked the popularity of 5e. Everybody wanted to play 5e because you could play it remotely through Zoom or online things. And then once COVID sort of subsided, people who really got into it, they started seeking out gaming stores to play. Well, here's the thing. A lot of GMs probably burned out, not a lot. There's a percentage of GMs that probably burned out, just like I need a break, and they haven't come back to play. But then again, there were so many players that were new to Dungeons & Dragons, period, that a lot of those were GMs. And I think a lot of GMs, a good number, have left because they felt that they weren't doing a good enough job. Or they tried it and just didn't like it. I mean, I get it. I don't like to play Dungeons & Dragons as a player. I like to be a DM. I like to be a GM. And so I've got to think that there are probably GMs out there that left because they were like, it's just not for me. I tried it, but it didn't work out, and I'm just going to go back to playing. So is there a GM shortage? Yeah, there probably is, and it's probably because I don't think our hobby had enough experienced DMs prior to COVID to handle the number of new players. And so when these new players are still wanting to play 5e, and people are returning to their normal lives, maybe they're not coming back to gaming. Maybe that was fun for them when COVID was around, but now, they want to go play golf, or they want to go out and hang out with their friends or whatever. And D&D was a fun little test or an experiment, and they had fun, but now they're on to something else. That happens. And so it not only is it going to be players that do that, but it's going to be DMs. But the thing is, because DMs are outnumbered 6-1 on average, right? We're talking averages. Because DMs are outnumbered, it's more noticeable when players start dropping out or not returning to the game. Obviously, for every one DM that drops out, you would need 6 players to drop out. And I don't think 6e players, in terms of quantity, if you take all the 5e players out there, all the 5e players, I don't think near enough of them have stopped playing D&D as there are DMs that stopped. I'm talking about ratio-wise. And so, yeah, I can totally see how there are way more players now than there are GMs, because the DMs have probably quit at a certain frequency, and I don't think you're going to see 6 players quitting for every one GM. I just think that's the numbers game. So, I said earlier that I'm part of the problem. Well, I don't think it's a problem. It's a matter of taste. I'm not part of the problem. I don't want to play 5e. You can't blame the GMs for not wanting to be a GM. It's often a thankless job, and I'm not saying that because I want my players to be just throwing themselves and saying, thank you for doing it. No, it's a thankless job. You do it because you love it, and you do it because it's fun, and you enjoy being a GM. But it's truly, just, you gotta love it. You've got to enjoy doing it, because you're not getting paid for it, and we'll get to that in a minute. You're not getting paid to do it typically, so you better really enjoy it. And if you don't, then it's time to head out. I mean, I get it. I don't enjoy playing golf. I don't enjoy playing baseball or well, I did. I don't enjoy playing soccer. I don't enjoy playing basketball. I have my hobbies, and I'm not knocking those, but I'm just saying we all know what we like and we know what we don't like. So GMs there's not enough of us. Well, that's going to force the issue. Here's the issue. You better step up, some of you players, and you might want to consider becoming a GM, especially if there aren't any in your city or whatever, and you want to play D&D. Well, you may be forced to play D&D as a GM. And I hate to use the word forced, but that's really what it comes down to. If nobody can do it and you want to play D&D and you've got players galore, but there's no DM, you may have to step up and be a DM. And I'm not going to address the issue, because I think Professor Dungeon Master and Questing Beast did it better. There's this thing about, well, is there, what can we do to train GMs? Well, I don't know. I mean, obviously GMs need to play more. They need to watch games being played. They need to read books like Sly Flourish's Lazy Dungeon Master to figure out, how they can simplify their game to make it more, easier for them to play or to run a game. I don't know. All I do know is that if there's a shortage of GMs, there's always a solution. And the solution is just more, people need to step up and be a GM, but not everybody wants to do that. I have had players that I've told, man, you really need to be a GM. You really should try it. And I've had players say, no, I have zero interest in ever being a GM. It doesn't interest me. I don't want to do it. Like, okay, no problem. I don't push it on people. But this whole GM shortage question, there's only so many solutions, right? Now, Wizards could offer some sort of incentive to be a GM. I don't know what that would be. It wouldn't be money. It would be maybe, access to online content that no one else had. I don't know. Wizards has got smart people. They could probably come up with some way to entice new players to become new GMs. that boat has sailed for me. I can't think of anything they could offer me to come back to 5e, even paid DM. And I told you I was going to talk about this. So apparently there are paid DMs out there, according to Professor Dungeon Master, who are charging $100 or more an hour to be a GM. And this has always been a sore spot with a lot of players. I've seen discussions where people go, "I would never pay a GM. That just goes against the spirit of the game." Well, okay, I get it. You wouldn't do that, but what if there's no GMs? What if the only way you can convince a GM to get behind the GM screen is to, pay them some money? And this is assuming they're a good GM, that they know what they're doing and they can give you a good game. Well, here's the deal. People may fuss about it and say, oh, GMs shouldn't get paid. But there are services out there, and there's one of them that comes to mind, and I can't recall the name of it. And I check it every now and then. And there are GM, and you can go on and it's got the GM's name or their moniker, and it'll tell you how many seats are available at their table and what their rates are and what game they're running and things like that. And when I went and checked, they're booked. A lot of those GMs are booked. And these are online games mostly. It's like they arrange for a scheduled time. You have a set time that you sign up for, and I don't know if it's done through Zoom or some other method, but it's there. And so the fact is, if people say, oh, I would never pay a GM, well, you may not, but guess what? There are people out there doing it. And you know what they're doing? You know what else they're doing? They're playing D&D. And it's probably 5e. I think most of those games that I saw are 5e. So it's funny to me that people go, oh, I would never do it. I blah, blah, blah. Well, then you wouldn't play D&D if there were no DMs. If all DMs charged a fee for their table and you want to play D&D, well, you don't have a choice. Luckily, there are a lot of GMs like myself who we don't charge. We do it because we love to play the game. I briefly considered a while back looking at charging a small fee, not much, to just do an online game. But I kind of got burned out of online D&D or online gaming. I did it while COVID was in session, and it just wasn't me. I prefer in-person, sit at a table, roll some dice, tear up some sheets, that kind of stuff. That's the game I prefer. And so it never moved forward. But I did consider it. Now, probably nobody would pay, and that's fine. But the financial incentive would have made me like, okay, if somebody's paying me money for me to sit down and be their GM, I'm going to give them a good game, good planning. There's going to be some miniatures and terrain and other things involved. I'm not gonna short them. They're going to get what they paid for. But I find it interesting that these paid DMs now are sort of in demand, and you know what? That's going to continue if new players don't start stepping up and becoming DMs. And again, there's that whole issue of, well, how do you become a good DM? Well, I don't know. I mean, like I said, you read books, you play games, you see what others are doing, and you just figure it out. I know that sounds simplistic, and it is in a way, but that's how a lot of us learned to be GMs, was just by doing it. So the point of this video, other than painting a miniature, I'm not here to provide solutions. I'm not here to offer up any ideas that are going to improve the situation. If there's a GM shortage, there's a GM shortage. And, hey, it is what it is, especially if it's 5e. If it's 5e, it's not my problem. It's not my problem because I don't play 5e anymore. I might be considered to play 5e in special circumstances. I don't know what those would be. But, like recently, maybe 6-7 months ago, my youngest son wanted to play a game of D&D. I ran him like 4 or 5 sessions, he and his friends, and I played 5e. It really wasn't 5e. Don't tell them that. It was, they made 5e characters, but I ran them old school way. I mean, I rolled dice. When I didn't know it, I just made it. They didn't know the difference. They didn't know what was going on. And I did have a screen for this one. They didn't know what was going on. But they had fun. They were playing Dungeons and Dragons in quotes. And I was playing really an old school fantasy game, and they just happened to be. And the reason I know it was old school was because 80% of their character sheet we never referenced. I never did DC rolls. I never did their those skills that are on the 5e character sheet. if somebody didn't have an arch what's the skill, somebody didn't have a what do you call it, intimidation skill, and the player said he wanted to intimidate somebody, I would just say, make this roll, make a roll of D20, and I'd tell them whether they made it or not. I didn't worry about the stupid skills, and they didn't notice either. Nobody ever called me on it and said, well, what are all these? Why am I not using this and this and this? Death saves. We did use death saves. You want to know why? One of the characters died, and I was just going to make it a death. But one of the other players said, yeah, you got to make a death save. They knew enough of the rules that they called me on it. And so I said, yeah, you make a death save, roll a D20, blah, 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 blah. But otherwise, they would have been dead. That's how I play it. So anyway, the miniature is done. He turned out really good. He fits the look and feel of the other ones that I've done. Green skin, sort of gold armbands, silvered weapons. I need to touch up his armor with a little bit of silver here and there just for detail work. And then this one is done. Now, I hope I haven't offended anybody. I don't think I've said anything offensive. I mean, I've said I don't play 5e. If you play 5e and you love it, guess what? I am so happy for you, because when we find the games that really just make us smile and we love them and love them, that is a great place to be. Because I know people that haven't found the game that just calls them, right? That just does it for them. They keep trying new games, and one day they'll find a game that just totally does it for them. It can be hard to do that because a lot of games that people find interesting and fun and just totally into, they're very small games or very independent games that nobody else plays. Maybe nobody plays in their area. And that in itself, that feeds on itself, right? When you find a role-playing game, not D&D or not one of the big names, and you enjoy it and you want to play it, well, guess what that forces you to do? You want your friends to play it too. Well, it forces you to be the GM. It's happened. When I first discovered Call of Cthulhu way back in the mid-'80s, it was first edition. I found it. I was a big H.P. Lovecraft fan. Nobody else knew about H.P. Lovecraft. I think I was one of the few kids that read it in my school. I just discovered it in the horror section, read it, and I was like, what is this mess? But I was also I loved literature and I loved reading, and so I was the weirdo. And so I got this Call of Cthulhu game. I read the rule book. I knew how to play it. I made characters for my players, and I invited them over and explained the game and said, we're going to play this. And we played it, and I probably didn't run it as best I could. And they didn't like it. They're like, nah, they just didn't care for it. And I look back on those days and I realize, you know what, that makes sense. I mean, Call of Cthulhu is it's an acquired taste. You either like the Cthulhu mythos or you don't. It either hits you as really cool, the whole setting, the 1920s, 1930s, or it doesn't. I don't know why I found that time period fascinating and why I found the mythos fascinating. I just did. And but I could not find any players to play it. They didn't want to play it. And so that game just sat on my shelf. And now it's up to like 7th edition. And now I can actually, if I wanted to run a game, I could find players, especially at conventions. There's always Call of Cthulhu games going on at conventions. It's just yet another game that I would have to divide my time on. But I want to do it because I do love Call of Cthulhu. So, but I just give you that to you as an example. That was a game where I didn't know anybody who played it. And so if I was going to play the game with my friends, I was going to have to be the keeper, which is the GM equivalent in Cthulhu. And I was okay with that. But that, unfortunately, is going to be the case with a lot of games. If you find a game that really does it for you, but nobody else plays it, you are going to have to step up and be the GM. And I think that's where we are finding 5e right now. I really do. I think that 5e has a lot of people that want to play it, but nobody wants to be the GM. They all want to play. And unfortunately, that's just not the reality of the game right now. There have to be GMs. And if there aren't any, then you're going to have people complaining that there's a GM shortage. And, that is what it is. So, I'm just about done with this video. How long has this one been going on? Whew, 45 minutes. But, you know, I try to paint a mini in an hour. So I did this one in under an hour. And I could have done it faster, but of course I was chatting with you and just sort of taking my time. I didn't want to mess this one up. But he turned out good, man. So I've got 5 of these guys now. They're a merc team of lizard armored men. They look so good. I'm so pleased with how these turned out. I'm going to have to give this one a dark wash on his weapon and maybe this headpiece thing that he wears. But I can't do that right now. I need the paint to dry really good before I do that. But what I'll do is I'll snap some photos of this and post them on my Facebook page so you can see what it looks like. And you know what? I guess I can go ahead and post some photos at the end of this video since I'm recording it. All right, that's all I have for this Paint a Mini session. I will put links below to the original video by Questing Beast. I'll also put a link to Professor DM's retort, which I think is totally interesting. I don't pretend to be an expert on this subject. I just wanted to add my 2 cents, right? And we all want to add our opinion. And I wanted to give you my opinion. You know, I don't think any of you are asking why doesn't Jim run a 5e game, but I do know there are people here in Atlanta who may be wondering why I'm not running a 5e game. Well, now you know. It's 5e ran its course with me, and so now I'm looking at going old school. I want to return to the fun, the craziness, the deadliness of that original Dungeons and Dragons game that I played back in middle school with my friends. And I don't need these 400-page adventures with plots and NPCs that have 3 pages written on them about their motives and their feats and their special abilities and things that as a GM I'm going to run it once and then that's gone. No, I want to know my game. I want to know the rules. I want to know the mechanics. I don't want there to be 1,000 spells. I need there to be a reasonable number of spells so that I can prepare and know how I'm going to react to when players do this, right? And this is an aside. You know, players would throw a spell at me that I'd never heard of, and it would totally throw a wrench in the game because it was so unexpected and so rules breaking. And I say rules breaking, it broke the game because I could not. It wasn't that I couldn't react fast enough to it, because I feel like I'm a pretty good improv GM. I can go with the flow. When the players go left, we'll go left. But sometimes there are wrenches that are thrown that are so difficult to blend into the game that it breaks and the game stalls. And I was getting that way too often with 5e. And the handful of games I've run of Old School Essentials, they were as smooth, fast-moving as any game I can remember when I was a kid. As a GM or a DM when I was a kid, man, if I didn't know it, I was winging it. I was making up stuff on the fly. If I rolled a random creature and I just didn't feel like looking it up, I just made the armor class and the hit points, and that's just what DMs do. The object of the game, in my opinion, for a DM, a GM, is to give the players a fun 2-3 hours, an adventure that you know has a little bit of story to it, has some danger, some risks, some puzzles, some combat. But the goal is to just sort of have some fun. And if the game is no longer fun to you, you need to find a different game. And so you say, well, take your own advice. I did. 5e was no longer fun to me. I found something else. And until Old School Essentials ruins the game by adding 20 books and thousands of monsters and spells, there's fan stuff, and I do some of this. There's fan-created content that's constantly being put out there for OSE, but it's not official stuff. You don't have to, you know, for some reason, and this is an aside again, for some reason, players and DMs of 5e feel that when a book comes out, it's an official book, therefore, I have to use it. And that's just not true. You, as a GM, you take what you want and you leave the rest behind. If I were to return if I were to return to a 5e game, here's how it would be. It would be a 5e game 2000. It would be the 5th edition 2000. It would be the 5e 2014 edition, meaning the players would use the player's handbook. I would use the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual, and that's how it would play. You can be a fighter, you can be a wizard, a sorcerer, a warlock, a illusionist, a bard, a cleric. There were more classes than there were in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons when it started. But now there's, 50, 60, 70 classes. I don't know how many races. It's done. So if I am ever convinced to return as a 5e DM, it would be a strict 2014 rulebook type thing. There you go. All right. That got way more serious than I really wanted it to, but I felt like I needed to give you my opinions on this, whether you wanted it or not. If you didn't like it, don't watch the video, or it's too late. You've already watched the whole thing. I do enjoy these painting moments because it does give me a time to paint a mini or two, but it also allows me to just share some of my thoughts with you. And so that's my rant and my opinion on the DM shortage, so to speak. All right, that's all I have for this video. Again, I'll post some pictures. I'll take some pictures of this and post it at the end of the video. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for listening. If you agree, let me know. If you disagree, let me know. It's fine. Just be nice about it. You don't have to be nasty in the comments. But always curious to know what my viewers and listeners, think and what they're playing and things like that. So let me know in the comments, and I'll do my best to respond if you post any questions. All right, this is Jim, the Tabletop Engineer. Thanks for joining me on this Paint a Mini video. I'll be back again very soon with another miniature. Until then, everybody, take care.